3. The Whistling River. It seems that some years before the winter of the blue snow, which every logger remembers because a heavy fall of bright blue snow that melted in the ink, giving the folks of the area writing stories they tell, old Paul was logging on what was known as the Whistling River. It got its name from the fact that every morning, right on the dot at 19 minutes after 5, and every night at 10 minutes after 6, it roared up to the height of 273 feet and let loose a whistle that could be heard in the distance of 603 miles in any direction. Of course, if one man listening to himself can hear that far, it seems reasonable to suppose that two men listening together can hear just twice as far. They tell me that even as far away as Alaska, almost every camp had 2 or 4 whistlers, as many were needed to hear the whistle without straining. We got 2 bits to listen, and did nothing but listen for the right time, especially quitting time. However, it seems that the river was famous for more than its whistling, for it was known as the honoriest river that ever ran between 2 banks. It seems to take a fiendish delight in trying whole rafts of good saw logs into a plane and fancy knots that 43 old sailors even knew the names of. It was an old sidewinder for fair. Even so, it was unlikely that old Paul would have ever bothered with it if it had left his beard alone. It happened this way. Seems old Paul had been sitting on a low hill one afternoon, combing his great curly beard with a pine tree, while he plans his winter operations. All of a sudden, and without a word of warning, the river hissed itself up on its hind legs and squirts about 4,519 gallons of river water straight in the center of old Paul's whiskers. Naturally, Paul is considerably startled, but says nothing, figuring that if he pays it no mind, it'll go away and leave him be. But no sooner does he get settled back to his thinking and combing again that the darn river squirts some more. This time, along with the water, it throws in a good measure of batch of mud turtles, 13 large carp, a couple of drowned muskrat, and half a raft of last year's saw logs. By this time, old Paul is getting pretty mad, and he jumps up and lets loose a yell that causes a landslide out near Pike's Peak. And startles a barber in Missouri, for it cuts half the hair of the minister's toupee, causing somewhat of a stir thereabouts. Paul stomps around, waving his arms for a spell, and allows, "By the jumping G. John Henry Great Horn Spoon, I'll tame that river or bust a gallus trying." He goes over another hill and then sits down to think of a way to tame the river, forgetting his winter operation entirely. He sits there for 3 days and 47 hours without top speed a while, and finally comes out to a conclusion that the best thing to do is to take out the kinks. He knows that taking the kinks out of the river is tricky as one apt to be quite a chore. So he keeps sitting there as he figures out ways and means. Of course, he could dig a neat channel and the river went through that, but that was never Paul's way. He liked to figure out new ways of doing things, even if they were harder. Meanwhile, he's gotten a mite hungry, so he hollers down to camp for sourdough Sam to bring up a little popcorn, of which he is very fond. So Sam hitches up a 4-horse team with his helpers and a popcorn, and soon arrives at Paul's feet with a wagon load. Paul eats the popcorn and thinks. The faster he thinks, the faster he eats, the faster he eats, the faster he thinks, until finally his hands are moving so fast that nothing shows but a blur, and they make the wind just uproot the trees around him. His chewing sounds like a couple 100 coffee grinders all going at once. In practically no time at all, the ground for 3 miles and a quarter of every direction is covered in a depth of 18 inches of popcorn scraps, and several thousand small birds and animals sitting on the ground all white in the air, filled look like snowflakes, conclude that a blizzard is upon them and immediately freeze to death, furnishing the men with pot pies for some days. But to get back to old Paul's problem, just before the popcorn is all gone, he decides that the very only practical solution is to hitch Babe, the mighty blue ox, to the river and let him yank it straight. Babe was so strong that he could pull mighty near anything that could be hitched to. His exact size, as I've said before, is not known, for although it is said that he stood 93 hands high, it's not known whether he meant ordinary lugger's hands or the hands of Paul's size, which, of course, would be something else again. However, The tail of an eagle that is able to habit the roosting on the tip of the babe's right horn, and suddenly decided to fly to the other. Columbus Day, and when it was started, it flew steadily, so they say, night and day, and weather foul, and its wing feathers were worn to pen feathers, and a new set grew to replace them. In all, he seems to have worn out 17 sets of feathers in the trip, and from reaching from the brush to the sweat top of the eyes so much, and he worn all his feathers off the top of his head, becoming completely bald, as are all the descendants to this day. Finally, the courageous bird won through, reaching the brass ball tip of the left horn on the 17th of March. He waved a wing weakly at the cheering lumberjacks and pulled as low as he could to make it sooner for the headwinds. But the problem is how to hitch Babe to the river, as it's well known, in fact, that nor a log chain and skid hook will not hold water. So after a light lunch of 3 sides of barbecued beef and half a wagon load of potatoes, carrots, and a few other odds and ends, old Paul goes down to the blacksmith shop and gets old, the big Swede, to help him look through the big instructions book and what came with the woods to tell how to do most everything under the sun. But though Paul reads the book through the front to the back twice, so reads it from back to front, and they both read it from once to the bottom to the top, they find nary a word about how to hook into a river. However, they do find an old almanac stuck between the pages, and get so busy reading up on the weather for the coming year, and all the fancy ailments of one kind and another, that it's supper time before they know it, and problems still unsolved. So Paul decides it's the only practical thing to do is to invent the rigging of some kind himself. At any rate, he has to do something, and every time he hears the river whistle, it makes him so mad he's fit to be tied, which interferes with his work more than something. No one can do their best under such conditions. Being as how this was a sort of special problem, he thought it out in a special way. Paul was like that. He always thought the best when he walked, and when he had men serve his circle about 30 miles in diameter to walk around, this was so that he could be quite a while thinking and wouldn't find himself down in Australia when he finished. Then everything was ready. He set his old fur cap tight on his head, clasped his hands behind him, and starts walking and thinking. He thinks and walks. The faster he walks, the faster he thinks. He makes a complex circle in half an hour. By morning, he's worn the path so that it's knee deep even on him, and he has to call his men to herd the stockaway and keep them from falling in and getting crippled. 3 days later, he thinks it out, and he's worn himself down so deep that it takes a day and a half to get a ladder built that will reach that far down. Then when he gets out, he doesn't even wait for breakfast. He whistles for Babe and tears right across the hills into the north. The men have no idea what he intends to do, but they know from experience that it'll be good, so they cheer until their throats are so sore they have to stay around the mess hall drinking Paul's private barrel of cough syrup until supper time. And after that, they all go to bed and sleep very soundly. Paul and the ox travel plenty fast, covering 24 townships in a stride, and the wind from their horizon raises the dust that doesn't even settle for months. There are some of those who claim the present dust storms are nothing more or less than the same dust beginning at the back of the earth, but that's another matter of opinion. About noon, as they reach the North Pole, they begin seeing blizzard tracks, and a short time after, the very heart of their summer feeding grounds. Taking a sack from his shoulder, Paul digs out the materials for a box trap, which sets a near well-traveled blizzard through. He baits the fresh icicles on top of the North Pole, and then he goes away to eat his lunch, but not until he's clearly brushed out his tracks, a trick he later taught the Indians. After lunch, he amuses himself for a while by throwing large chunks of ice into the water for the babe to retrieve. But as soon as the whistle the great beast out again, every time he jumps into the water, he causes such a splash that a tidal wave threatens Galveston, Texas, which at the time was inhabited by nobody in particular. Some of the ice he threw in is still floating around the oceans, causing plenty of excitement for the iceberg patrol. About 2 o'clock, he goes back to the blizzard trap and discovers that he has caught 7 half-grown blizzards, and one grizzled old nor'wester, which was causing a considerable fuss, and bids fair to trample the young ones before he can get them out. But he finally manages to get a pair of half-grown ones in his sack and turns the others loose. About midnight, he gets back to his camp and hollers at old, the big Swede. "Build me the biggest log chain that's ever been built while I stake out these dead blasted blizzards. We're going to warp it in the proper place till morning. Then he goes down to the foot of the river and tickets one of the blizzards to the tree next to the bank, then crosses and ties the other directly opposite. Right away, the river begins to freeze. In 10 minutes, the slush ice reaches the bank from bank, and the blizzards are not yet real warm to the work either. Paul watches for a few minutes and then goes back to camp to warm up, feeling mighty well satisfied by the way things are working out. In the morning, the river has a tough time running up, for it maybe knows its last whistle, for its foot was frozen solid more than 17 miles. The blizzards have really done their business. By the time breakfast is over, a great chain's ready and the babe and all harnessed. Paul quick wraps the end of the chain 72 times around the foot of the river and hitches the other babe. The morning commences to stand out, he shuts at the old ox to pull. But though the great beast strains until his tongue hangs out, pulling the chain into a solid bar, and some are 7 miles long, and sinks knee deep in solid rock, the river stubbornly refuses to budge, hanging onto its kinks like a snake in a gopher hole. Seeing this, old Paul grabs the chain and let loose and hollers that blows the tarper off the shacks in Nebraska sandhills. He and the ox together give a mighty yank and jerks the river loose from end to end, and starts hauling it across the prairie so fast that it smokes. After a time, Paul comes back and sights on the river, which is now as straight as a gun barrel. But he doesn't have long to admire his work, for as soon as he finds another problem on his own hands. You see, in its way, a straight river is naturally much shorter than a crooked one, and all the miles and miles of extra river that used to be in the kinks are running wild on the prairie. This galls the farmers in those parts of the Little, so it looks like Paul had better figure something out mighty soon, for already he can see clouds of dust the prairie folks are raising as they come at him with top speed to claim damages. After 3 minutes of extra deep thought, he sends a crew to camp and bring the old big crosscut saw and a lot of baling wire. He saws the river into 9-mile lengths, and then the men roll it up like linoleum and tie it with wire. Some say he used these latter when he logged in the desert, rolling out many lengths as he needed to fill logs, but that's another story. But his troubles with the Whistling River were not all over. It seems that being strained took a sort of gimp out of the river, and from some day that refused to whistle even a bird call. And Paul had gotten into the habit of depending on the whistle to wake up the men in the mornings, when things were might upset. First, he had hired an official getter-upper who rode through the camp on a horse and beat a triangle. But the camp was so big that it took 3 hours and 70-odd minutes to make the trip. Naturally, some of the men were called too early and some too late. It's hard to say what might have happened if Squeaky Swanson hadn't shown up at the time. His speaking voice was quite thin, but when he hollered, he cleared her to Kansas in a still day. So every morning he stood outside the crook shack and hollered the blankets off every bunk in camp. Naturally, the men didn't stay in bed long after the blankets were off, with what a cold wind and all. So Squeaky was a great success for the years and did nothing but holler in the mornings.